Welcome to all of you, and not least to our distinguished speakers to this webinar, which we are organizing at DIIS under the title Cosmic Conflict, Religion and Armed Struggle. I'm Elena Maria Gyd. I'm a senior researcher here at DIIS. I'm also heading the research unit on peace and violence, and I've also been part of a group here at DIIS who have been working over the past year on the nexus between religion and conflict. And I will be saying a little bit about the aim of this webinar, also about the program, and then I'll present the speakers. So our aim with this webinar today is to contribute to what is already ongoing discussions on what role religion plays in contemporary wars and armed conflicts. A role that, especially since the 9/11 attacks in New York, has begun to be taken seriously within the social sciences, within security studies, within international relations, and so forth. Evidently, most research over the past years, also here at DIIS, has focused on Islamist and jihadist movements. But here our ambition at this webinar is to look across different religions and how a variety of violent non-state movements like rebel groups, insurgents, militant groups articulate religion in various ways, not only in relation to Islam, but as I mentioned, also in relation to other religions like Buddhism, African traditional religions, Hinduism, Christianity, and we also have researchers here at DIIS now working on paganism. This comparative perspective has been central to the work of our distinguished keynote speaker here today, Professor Mark Juergensmeyer, and also other prominent scholars like Professor Mark Juergensmeyer. A core question raised here is the relationship between violence and religion, and in particular the way religion informs different non-state militant groups. The purpose is not here to determine any singular or isolated causal relationship between the two, between religion and violence, but rather to ask questions like, how does religious imaginaries, narratives, symbols, and practices influence and drive conflicts, for example, by facilitating the mobilization, the justification, or legitimization of armed struggle and extremist violence? What does religion make to violent conflicts? What difference does religion make to violent conflicts, for example, in addition to other interlocking factors or stakes like political and economic stakes? Is there something distinctive or particular about religion in relation to or in comparison with, for instance, political ideologies? And what does a religious analytical perspective add to our understandings of violent conflict? In our research here at DIIS, which we will also hear more about, we believe that a better understanding of religious dimensions of violent conflicts and of what drives militant groups seen from a religious perspective are also very important to discussing pathways to peace, conflict resolution, and prevention of extremism. So this is a little bit about the background. Now just a short overview of the program today. We will begin with the keynote speech by Professor Mark Juergensmeyer, which is followed by a conversation with senior researcher Mona Kandal-Shaikh, who has worked on some of these issues as well. Second, we will have a panel with 3 presentations. And third, we will have a Q&A session that is moderated by senior researcher Per Schouten, and who will also do the final remarks. And just a little bit of practicalities. There will only be questions taken at the end, but you are very welcome to use the Q&A function already beginning during the keynote, where you can write some of the questions. And if you have particular questions for Professor Mark Juergensmeyer, please write those in the beginning, and then Mona will try, as she's in conversation with Professor Juergensmeyer, to incorporate at least some of these questions. But before I give over the word to the keynote speaker, let me just say a few words about him and also about the other speakers. So we are very honored to have you here today, Professor Mark Juergensmeyer. You're professor of religious studies at University of California, Santa Barbara, and you've also founded the FALEA, I hope I say it correctly, Center for Global and International Studies. You are really a pioneer in the research on global religion, on religious violence, on conflict resolution, and also of South Asian religion and politics. Professor Juergensmeyer has published extensively and have received several rewards for his books like the well-known Terror in the Mind of God, The Global Rise of Religious Violence from 2017. He has made groundbreaking contributions to our understandings of religiously motivated violence And he's also always used a comparative perspective, focusing on different religions and looking at some of the similar mechanisms that go across these religions in terms of mobilizing people around violent actions. Methodologically, he has also made very important contributions where he's combined what is often done within theology, looking at religious texts and myths, but he's also used very anthropological methods, doing in-depth interviews with the leaders and members of militant religious movements. So with this background, we are really very honored to have you at this seminar looking at some of these questions. Secondly, Professor Mark Juergensmeyer will be in a conversation with Mona Kamel-Shaikh, who is a senior researcher here at DIIS and who also leads the research unit on global security and worldviews. She is also at the same time coordinating a large ERC-funded project on trying to explain transnational jihad, and she has worked extensively over the years on militant groups, amongst these, especially the Taliban. She has contributed to these theoretical debates extensively that we are discussing today on the role of religion in violent conflict and the linkages between religion and violence. We're also very happy today to have Professor Iselin Frydenlund, who is from the Norwegian School of Religion, Security and Society. She's also affiliated to PRIO, or the Peace Research Institute in Oslo, and to Norwegian Center for Human Rights. She has worked on the relationship between Buddhism, violence, nationalism, and politics, focusing in particular on Theravada Buddhist movements in Sri Lanka and also lately in Myanmar. And we're very happy to have you here focusing on these Buddhist linkages between Buddhism and violence. Secondly, we have Christoph Titeka, who is a senior lecturer at the Institute of Development Policy at the University of Antwerp. His research focuses on governance and conflict in spaces where the state is weakly present, and particularly has focused on Central and Eastern Africa. He's done a lot of research on the Lord Resistance Army in Uganda, and that's also what he's going to mainly talk about today. Then we have Maya Grievous, who we are also very proud to have as a researcher here at DIIS. She looks at the nexus between religion and gender and violent extremism. And Maya has done some really interesting work where she has followed several Danish foreign fighters who have traveled to the Middle East and also then interviewed and followed them when they have returned to Denmark. She's now going to be starting up a postdoc in collaboration with Edinburgh University, where she would be looking at the topic of masculinity in relation to extremism. And finally, we have also our own Per Schouten, who's a senior researcher here at DIIS. He has been looking at the political economy of conflicts and rebel groups in the Congo, Central African Republic, and also South Sudan. And he particularly has been looking at infrastructure and roadblocks and their linkages to conflict dynamics. But right now, he's actually also starting a study that brings in more religion, looking at the cosmological orders of the Mai Mai rebel groups in the Congo. So with these words, I'm very happy to say welcome and thank you to all the speakers, and to give the word over to Professor Mark Juergensmeyer.
Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here, and I look forward to the discussion. I look forward to having a chance to share some of my ideas and my thinking with you, and to get engaged in a conversation, not just with Mona, whom I always enjoy getting into conversations with, but with everybody else on a very important topic. So I'm going to focus on this very simple question: does religion cause violence? It's a topic that surfaced in the last 30 years because of the rise of religion in political life around the world since the end of the Cold War, when at the time the prophecy was that the world would become like all Western countries, secular individual nation states, and didn't quite turn out that way. We've seen just an ugly rise of strident ethnic and religious violence around the world, new nationalisms, new transnationalisms. And the question is, why? Why is this happening now? And what does religion have to do with it? So these are the two questions that for the last 30 years I've been exploring in a series of books and articles, and the most recent of which is the God at War, which just came out a couple months ago. But I got to tell you, I'm still asking the same questions. Why now? And what does religion have to do with it? My explorations in this topic began with the Sikhs in India. And it happened really by chance. This was a part of India that I had lived for a number of years. I taught at Punjab University. And I've always been interested academically in the interaction of religion and politics. And so when this awful spiral between the young Sikh men and the Indian government developed in the Punjab, led by this guy, Sant Janal Singh Bhindranwale, I wanted to know why. It was not just an intellectual question, although it was that. It was also a deeply personal question, because these could have been my students who were wrapped up in this awful spiral of violence. And what was it that they were involved in? What did they think they were doing? And what motivated them? And perhaps most profoundly, what did religion have to do with it? So this case then continued, and what I determined was that the war was really not with other religious groups, but with the secular state. But to my shock, then the secular state in India itself became increasingly dominated by religious politics, with the rise of the BJP and with the strident kind of Hindu nationalism, particularly in the riots in Gujarat, attacks on Muslims. So it was clear that this was not an issue that was idiosyncratic to the Sikhs. And elsewhere in South Asia and Sri Lanka and nearby in Myanmar, even in a Buddhist country, and you think, well, Buddhists, those are the peaceful people, right? Those are the people who believe in nonviolence. Well, this monk by the name of Wiratu cheerfully greeted me when I came into his study, and he said to me, "Do I look like a terrorist?" And he kind of giggled when he said it. And I felt like saying, "Yeah, you look like most of the terrorists that I've met, actually," which is to say, like everybody else. And the reason he asked that question is that he had just been on the cover of Time magazine. His face was on the cover with the words, "The face of Buddhist terror." And the reason why he was the face of Buddhist terror was a kind of the incendiary words which were taken as advocating violence against Muslims throughout Myanmar, particularly the Rohingya in the Northeast, who just in a hideous kind of way have been ostracized from what has been their homeland for centuries and maybe earlier, and have been driven out, homes burned, houses destroyed, Muslims burned alive in their house. You see these horrible pictures of then ISIS burning other people alive. Well, Muslims are capable of the same kind of hideous violence. What does religion have to do with all of these things? Christianity is not immune from this either. In the United States, we like to think of ourselves as proudly secular, but there is the rise of the Aryan nation. And then, Timothy McVeigh, the fellow who was behind the Oklahoma City Federal Building bombing, which is the largest act of terrorism in the United States before 9/11, before the attack on the World Trade Center, thought he was saving Christendom. And his book, The Turner Diaries, was all about this group, the Order, which was going to save Christendom somehow from the plight of secularists. Anders Breivik in Norway thought he was trying to save Christendom from the rise of Islam. Not a pious person. He wasn't particularly religious. I mean, what did religion have to do with it? He thought he was saving Christendom, and yet he wasn't really Christian. The politics of this last year in the United States, actually the last 4 years under Trump, particularly came to light in the recent election of the sort of strident religiosity and the kind of we-they sense of protecting our Islamic, our Christian and Jewish heritage against Muslims, which has been a trope throughout the Trump administration. And of course, within Islam, various forms of militant religiosity, of militant strident movements. The idea of the Muslim Brotherhood that developed in Egypt came across the border into Pakistan to really change the face of the Palestinian nationalist movement, which had been secular up until around 1990. So it was soon after that I went to see Sheikh Yassin. Both of us look a little bit different then. You can see I'm a little bit younger and he's a little bit, well, alive, because he's been then killed by an Israeli strike. But one of the things he told me on that early meeting, and I think I'm one of the few people to have interviewed him, was that Palestine would never be free until it's a Muslim state. And that was the message that he brought to the Palestinian movement. Now, one of the things that struck me about this was that just the day before, I talked with this guy, a Jewish rabbi, who said virtually the same thing about Judaism, that Israel would not be truly Israel until it was biblical Israel. And so Rabbi Meir Kahane was trying to get rid of the Palestinians that he thought was keeping Israel from being truly Israel. He's gone now, and so is Sheikh Yassin. But last year I talked with this guy, who's the grandson of Meir Kahane. Same message, Palestinians have to go. Israel will not be Israel until it is truly Israel. So what are the common threads that go through all of this? Were images of religion, religious justifications, forms of motivation, but also this extraordinary image of cosmic war, the great battles that often are taken metaphorically, but then implanted on worldly battles. This seemed to be a common connection among the various strident religious movements that I saw. Well, then does this mean then that religion causes violence? Well, let's take the case of ISIS. Take a few minutes to look at it. Was ISIS really about religion? I mean, it seems to be about religion. Islam is in its name, very much focused on Islamic ideology, on apocalyptic images from Islamic history, but is it about religion? This is the question that I presented to some of the refugees outside of Mosul this last couple of years when I've been going there to talk with them. And one of the fellows said, in response to my question of whether ISIS was a religion, he said, well, if it was a religion, it's a strange religion. It's not the Muslim, it's not the Islam of my mother's Islam, it's not an Islam that we recognize. And then he thought, and he said, well, maybe it's more political than it is religious. I mean, the fact that you can't really kind of figure out what it is gives you a tip-off about how complicated the topic is. Because what do you mean when you're talking about religion? Are you talking about ideology? You're talking about ideology? You're talking about community? You're talking about culture? What is it that you mean when you're talking about religion? Now, in the case of Iraq, there are these, in terms of religious identity, these divisions between the Sunni and the Shia Arabs in the south and west, and the Kurds in the north, who are also Sunni, but ethnically different. And so there is an ethnic and religious identity differentiation, and therein lies a lot of the difficulty. Because after the US invasion and the war in Iraq and the ouster of the secular leaders, Saddam Hussein, who was kind of the glue who held everything together, there was an anarchy and a development of a new religious politics. In the vacuum created by the absence of Saddam, people began organizing, but they organized around religion, religious parties, Shia, Sunni parties. And with the rise of Shia political power, the Sunnis quickly realized that they were in a minority numerically and out of power. And this meant that they were fated to be marginalized within their own country. And that, of course, was the basis upon which al-Baghdadi was able to rise to power, first in al-Qaeda in Iraq, and then with a whole new movement, the Islamic State. Al-Baghdadi, pictured here in these pictures taken when he was briefly held prisoner by the American forces, let his beard grow out, put on a robe, proclaimed himself the great caliph of the Islamic State. Well, I guess that's pretty religious. But the remarkable thing is that it was also very much a political movement, and like a blitzkrieg, it swept over Syria and Iraq, because in Syria, the Sunnis also felt that they were alienated, even though they were the majority in Syria. the leadership was led by a kind of Shia political organization, Alawites, kind of Shia. But in any event, the Sunni Arabs felt that they were second-class citizens in their own country. So in this base of Sunnistan, the Sunni area of eastern Syria and western Iraq, al-Baghdadi and his forces were able, like a blitzkrieg, to create a new political entity. It was clearly a Sunni Arab entity, but it was run in the most hideously brutal kind of way. You know, they ruled through terrorism against their own people, as well as an attempt to try to expand their power. But it was a religious movement. I mean, who joined? Who were the followers? Well, there was certainly Saddam's old army and his own administration that had no role in the new Iraq, in part because of American policies when they were in charge, in part because of the power of the Shia government. So they were just looking for a job. They were looking for a role. They were looking for a place. They were looking for dignity for their people, for Sunni people. So the ordinary followers of Iraq, the people who waved the banners, were not religious crazies, scarcely religious at all, really. I mean, they were simply trying to get dignity and a role for their own people. So in these great refugee camps that are outside of Mosul today, after the fall of ISIS, you can see all of the people who were left homeless by the destruction of great sections of the city in the attempt to try to liberate it from ISIS, including a lot of people who've been former followers of ISIS. And I just happened to run across these two guys, which I report about in the book that I'm working on right now, on how terrorist movements come to an end. That they had been supporters of ISIS. They had been part of the ISIS administration, but not as fanatics. They were just guys who were looking for a job, basically. they were looking for something that would give Sunni Arabs some identity, some location. This is not true of some of the people I talked with in prison. These were the hardened, true blue ISIS fighters. And there was one guy, especially Muhammad, who had started off at age 15 in Mosul as a largely concerned about Sunni identity and the fact that the Sunnis really had lost power against the rise of Shia control. But then over time, especially after they were thrown in prison, and in prison, they said the Americans were so stupid. They put them in prison and then they put them all together, and then they formed classes. They created a whole Islamic university, a kind of jihadi university within the prison. He says, and that's where he really learned about jihad. And that's where he learned about the Islamic State. That's where he learned about the caliphate. And that's when it became a religious mission for him. And he became converted. It became a whole new project. This conflict, this battle, which was a kind of an earthly battle, had now been lifted into the high proscenium, a religious drama. And now he was a fighter in a cosmic war. It was a whole different kind of warfare for Muhammad, which is interesting, and it's true of the inner circle. So when William McCants and Graham Wood write about the apocalyptic ideology of ISIS, that's what they're talking about. They're talking about this kind of inner circle and the vision that some of the most fervent followers of ISIS have in a belief of the caliphate and the belief of all of the prophetic aspects of the ISIS ideology that are, and the kind of extremity of their punishment and the brutality of their actions, all verified in their minds by Islamic history and by Islamic scripture. It is a particular kind of worldview. It's a particular kind of vision. It's not the worldview of all of the followers, including these guys. I mean, there's some 30,000 young people who just picked up stakes and they came to Syria. Some of them stayed online and then created acts of terrorism in disparate places like in Belgium or in Istanbul or in Paris. But these guys all came these guys all came to Syria to fight. They came from the Middle East, they came from Europe, they came from Germany, probably from Denmark, Canada, United States. They're all dead. Every single one of these. They didn't last very long because ISIS just used them as cannon fodder. They would strap a suicide belt around them and throw them out in order to, wreak terror. Very useful for ISIS. I mean, very cynically useful to waste lives in such a way. But here they came. Why were they there? Were they that true Muslim? I have students who've been following them on some of these people on chat rooms and on Twitter, and a lot of them know really very little about Islam. I mean, some of the guys came in with a great excitement and vigor with Islam for Dummies in their knapsack when reading it on the airplane when they came to Syria, so they could know a little bit about the religion they supposedly were supposed to be a part of. But for them, it was war. It was the great battle. It was the battle. It was the cosmic battle itself that drew them. The excitement of it, the glamour of it, the adventure of it, an adventure that, of course, led, in the case of most of them, to their deaths. So their worldview was a different one, and their motivations were different, and what they thought they were discovering as an alternative to the world they left was different as well. So when Thomas Hedgeheimer talks about jihadi culture, I think he's on to something very important. That is, we try to isolate, the political factors, the religious factors. What he's done is tried to look at the culture of the jihadi culture of ISIS and of movements like this, and the kind of lure, the attraction of this alternative lifestyle. And it seems to me that's really getting at the answer. So a number of years ago, there was a scholar from Denmark who came to California. You may recognize this picture. Mona Sheikh, who's a very nice person, very pleasant, but I gotta tell you, she hangs out with a pretty brutal crowd. This is the Pakistan Taliban, some of her friends, I guess, but she was trying to figure out what made them tick and what religion had to do with it. Some of the same kinds of questions that I had to ask in my own work. And so Mona and her husband, Matthias, and their lovely family came to Santa Barbara, and we had a lot of conversations about what it was that we were trying to do and what it was that we were trying to discover. And when we concluded that we were really looking at worldviews, we're not looking at particular factors, but how all these things came together. And when Mona organized a conference at Santa Barbara, and then we brought together people who were doing similar kind of work, this book was the result of it, Entering Religious Minds, the social study of worldviews, trying to locate religion within that context. And that struck me as so relevant. Because years ago, after the terrible terrorist attack in Spain, the Spanish government brought a bunch of scholars to Madrid, largest conference of terrorist scholars. And I was put in charge of the group of religious scholars to look at, we were charged with one question: what is the root cause of religious violence? So all they wanted to know, what is, you guys work at it for a week and then come back and tell us what is the root cause of religious violence. So we talked a lot that first day. And the second day we were ready to come back and give our report. And they said, second day, you're already ready to give your report? He said, yes, we're ready to report. And they said, well, what is it? What is the root cause of religious violence? They said, well, actually, what we wanted to report is we don't like the metaphor. There is no root cause of religious violence. What we want to propose is a different metaphor. We want to propose a metaphor of the forest fire. So if you have a forest fire, what causes it? Is it the dry, hot conditions? Is it the combustible fuel, a lot of dead trees? Is it the spark that ignites it? Is it all of those things or none of them? And then they all kind of come together to create this event. And it's more just than a something, it's an event. And it's a worldview. Wildfire is a worldview, destroying and creating new worlds. And what caused it? All of these things, they come together in an extraordinary way. And sometimes it happens and sometimes it doesn't happen. There's no simple formula to forest fires. There's no simple formula to religious violence and to religious terrorist movements. This book that I just completed, and it's been out now a couple months, I try to explore more fully the relationship between war and religion. And I start off with that assumption that Mona and I made about religion and apply it also to war, that war is also a worldview, that war and religion are really two competing worldviews. They're rivals in a sense, but religion uses war, usually metaphorically, as the kind of internal struggle. War uses religion because God always seems to be on our side in a battle, doesn't it? But sometimes religion and war are fused in a kind of apocalyptic cosmic war. And it's this image that I found early on so frequently in so many different movements when I studied them around the world. This kind of cosmic integration of the two worldviews of religion and war. But they're worldviews. And so to understand the role of religion in ISIS is really to understand the ISIS worldview and to see how it looks different in terms of the Sunnis who see this as an identity movement, those young people who are warriors and see this as a warrior worldview, those true believers who see it as an apocalyptic worldview of cosmic war. You have at least three different worldviews going on in the same movement, but they are worldviews in conflict with each other and with that ordinary reality to which they are an alternative. So what is the role of religion? In some ways, it's a response to worldviews in peril. Religious violence comes from the loss of faith in the old worldview, secular institutions, secular nation states, the rise of new religious-related worldviews. So does religion cause violence? I'm not sure that's the right question. I guess the question I would want to ask is, what is religious role in this, providing a face for shattered worldviews and providing an attempt to make them whole? That's the question I would like to answer. And I hope that's the question that will motivate our discussion. I appreciate very much your patience in letting me present these ideas, and I look forward to the conversation to come.
Thank you very much, Professor Mark Juergensmeyer, for this fascinating presentation. And I'm really happy to give the word over to Mona, who you have already introduced so kindly in your PowerPoint presentation. Here you go, Mona.
Thank you so much. And yes, thank you, Mark, for your lovely presentation. You managed to talk about a lot of stuff within the half hour you had. And I think I want to dig a little bit into some of the topics you mentioned in order to try to elaborate for those who are watching also, how is it relevant for the field of comparative studies? If you look at the different kinds of movements and actors that are active today on the global stage, how can we then use some of the concepts you have developed in order to better understand what they are about? We already also have a question, I think, but I'll try to integrate it in the dialogue. But I had three topics that I want to talk to you about. And the first is, of course, the overall question of cosmic wars that you developed. And as you have described in different articles and also in books, that religious conflicts are characterized by this escalation of what we could call worldly conflicts or ordinary conflicts into this sacred drama, as you described, where it becomes a matter about good versus evil and some like more abstract value systems against each other's. And you have recently been involved in different, in at least one big project at Uppsala University, which is about thinking in terms of how cosmic wars end. And I would really like you to share some of your thoughts about that part of it, because as we all know, there are some processes that makes religious conflicts very hard to solve because it becomes this very existential kind of conflict. But how can we, is there any lessons learned when you look at religious conflicts also historically, but also across different contexts, which can tell us something about how conflict or cosmic wars end? So that's the first topic I want to talk to a bit about. And the second one is also what you mentioned about, social theology, which was an approach that we identified together while I was in the US, which is this a combination of looking at social dynamics, but also taking seriously the worldview of these actors. So my question will also be here: what can that kind of perspective bring to the field of comparative studies? And third, I want to dig a little bit into worldview analysis, but we can wait a bit with that and see if we have time for that. But the first question, Mark, what are your thoughts about how cosmic wars can end?
Well, you're going to have to buy the next book because that's the subject of the next book. As you know, I've been working on this for the last couple of years. 3 case studies. One is ISIS. One is the Khalistan movement in India, which is the one I began my curiosity into religious nationalist movements in some 30 years ago. And the third is a movement I had not studied before, and that is the Mindanao movement in southern Philippines, the moral movement for a separate Muslim Mindanao in southern Philippines. So each of these movements have come to an end, sort of, in different ways, some more recently than others and some more successfully than others. But I was interested in exactly what you're talking about. How do images of grand warfare, even cosmic warfare, and in my recent book, I've tried to be a little bit more, differentiate a little bit in the kind of what we call cosmic warfare and grand warfare and so forth. But one, just like one kind of falls into love and then falls out of love, one can kind of fall into war and also fall out of it. It's and it happens almost that quickly, or at least that dramatically. And the reason for that is it's a worldview. And that's the point of this recent book. That war is a worldview. You get in, you're either in it or you're not in it. And when you're not in it, it all seems weird, which is why terrorism looks so strange to us, when we're the victims of it or we see it happening in other parts of the world. But if you are a supporter or involved in it in some way, it's normal because you see yourself at war. And so all you're doing is just kind of acting out an aspect of war that is very real to you and that you have already seen. I'm trying to explain how the world looks from the internal perspective of people who are within it, which, by the way, gets to your methodological question about social theology. That's the whole point of trying to enter into somebody else's worldview and to see the world the way they see it and to relate their religious ideas to their social location, which is what we were talking about in social theology. But to do that, you have to enter their world. And it's, you're taking this basic idea that people do things for rational reasons that make sense within their context. They look crazy to us because they're not our worldview. They're acting out of another out of another frame of reference. So it's understanding that frame of reference that's so important. But that frame of reference, particularly, an image of cosmic war is, after all, a kind of fantastic frame of reference. It's an imagined world, just like much of religion is an imagined world. And so people convert into religion, and they may take it enormously seriously in ways that seem to those of us who are not in a particular religious movement as just crazy, or wacky, or just, they're doing strange things because they're true believers. Within their context, it makes sense. But then they can fall out of this. And so what I was trying to understand is, what are the conditions in which they fall out of it? They fall out of war. And in most of the cases, it just happens by itself over time. Movements fall apart from within, in part because of infighting, different factions fighting each other, power grabs, followers seeing the leaders now not as great, wonderful leaders, but as kind of graspy, greedy, individuals who are just out after power, and they become disillusioned with the nobility of the whole thing. And that can be enough to just trigger a collapse in the legitimacy of the whole thing. And so it all comes crashing down like a house of cards. Or in the case of, I'm kind of mushing everything together, because when I do this study, I look at each case, and I look at how there are different factors in different cases. In the case of the Philippines, for example, one of the guys with whom I talked was just an absolute dedicated kind of terrorist warrior for the Muslim cause. And what really turned him around was when the Philippine government very sensibly sent this general who had been a former communist, who had left the military and then himself had become a terrorist and fought against it and then came back again. So he could then talk to them as somebody who knew what it was like to be a rebel. And he could talk with them and say, realistically, and say, look, I understand where you are, but this is not going to work. This will not, So reality, just being convinced of, and this is also true of the followers of ISIS in many cases, when they realized it was not going to work anymore, the caliphate was dead, then reality kind of broke in a way that allowed this whole thing to come crashing down. And yet, some of the people I talk with are still true believers. Some of those guys, like that guy in prison I talk with, he's still waiting for the caliphate to come about. He realizes right now that he can't go out and start killing people. That would be crazy, right? But if the movement started up again, he would be there. He would be the first in line. So the vision still stays, even though the movement has died away. It's complicated and interesting question.
Time flies, so we already only have like 1 or 2 minutes left. So I'm just gonna rush forward. And we had one question which was about whether the grand warfare of today is very much about religion against religion, or if global Islam is the big enemy, instead of what you said in the 1990s, that it is about religion versus some kind of secular vision of the world, which is clashing. So do you have anything to add to that? Is it still the same that one of the world's largest conflict lines goes between religion on one side and that secularism on the other, or has this dynamics changed during the past years?
No, I think in general that's still true. But of course, in Iraq, it's a kind of Sunni Shia division, but not really around religion in a narrow sense, except of course to the true believers and for the inner circle of ISIS. The Shia are heretics and they're therefore kind of agents of the devil. But it's all premised on a social situation in which they are excluded, they're outsiders, and so you can't say this is purely a religious fight. It's obviously also a social political fight that has been religionized in a very dramatic kind of way. So I don't know of any instance of like pure religion in our construction of religion is somehow divorced, the ideology or the idea is divorced from the social situation. I'm not really sure that ever happens in life, but it certainly doesn't happen in the movements that I've studied.
No. And can I just round up by saying that one of the merits, if I should say it myself, of worldview analysis is exactly that it can encompass both religious and secular worldviews, plus that it opens up for acknowledging or appreciating that in the world you have different perceptions of rationality, different perceptions of justice, different perceptions of legitimacy, and so on. So it's not that rationality is just one kind of, value system, or it's not just an objective condition, but it can look like it can vary according to worldviews. I think we have to actually move to the next step in the program. So Per, thank you so much, Mark, for your
My pleasure.
presentation and for allocating time for the questions here. And I know that it's very late right now in the US, so you have to move on and go to sleep. So thank you so much for being here with us today.
It was a pleasure. It's great to be with all of you.
Yeah, thank you so much. And thank you also to you, Mona. The conversations could have gone on for much longer with these huge and really interesting questions. Per, I'm going to give the word to you because you're going to be moderating the next exciting panel today. And good night to you, Mark.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Mark. Thanks, Mona, and also Helene for moderating this first part of our meeting today, in which we had a great kind of large-scale overview of some of the issues at stake. So what we're going to do in the second half of this program is take a bit of a more deep dive in three different places, three different kind of religious conflict constellations, and I want to just go straight into it. So Iselin, you've been working a lot on one of the kind of religions that Mark already mentioned in passing, and your presentation is called Protecting Buddhism, Buddhist Just War in Times of Crisis. Iselin, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Pierre. I will try to share my screen now. Would this be the right one? I wonder.
No.
No.
There we are.
Does it look all right now?
Yes.
Yes. All right. So good morning, everyone, and good afternoon to those in a different time zone. My name is Iselin. I'm truly happy to be here. And thanks a lot for the invitation and to the organizers for making this event happen. Yes, I've been working on Sri Lanka and Myanmar for quite some time now. And I've been working on Buddhism and violence as an interesting case for understanding exactly this relationship between religion and violence and armed conflict. The case study I have chosen is the so-called Rohingya refugee crisis in 2017 that took place in Myanmar. And I'm sure you all remember these horrific images of refugees leaving Myanmar into Bangladesh. And according to the UN numbers, more than 742,000 refugees fled to Bangladesh in between late August 2017 until late July 2019. And the Kutupalong refugee camp in Bangladesh is now the largest refugee settlement in the world and home to some 600,000 Rohingya refugees. Now, the question that interests me is, what was the response of the Buddhist religious elites to the massive violence against civilians that we saw during the fall of 2017. Myanmar is a predominantly Theravada Buddhist country with a 90% Buddhist population. And the violence against the Rohingyas is unprecedented in Myanmar history. First, I would need to say that at the heart of the conflict is diverging views between the international community and the majority of population in Myanmar regarding the nomenclature of the Rohingya. So the Myanmar state codifies and recognizes 135 different so-called races or ethnic groups, and the Rohingyas are not on that list. So the Rohingyas claim to be part of the Myanmar state, and the Myanmar state refuses to accept them and do not even wish to use the word Rohingya. So they are called Bengalis, and the state and the majority population would say that these are illegal immigrants from Bangladesh. So that's the heart of the conflict. So it's more ethnicity than religion, I would say, at the core of the conflict. But then, as we will see, religion comes in, or Buddhism comes in, as a justifying factor for these atrocities in the Rakhine state. So the question then is, what was the response from Buddhist monks to the mass atrocities? Silence. More than anything, what we see is silence from the Sangha. The Sangha is the word for the monastic community, including both monks and nuns. So although we might have here and there a few voices that raise their concern about this, the overall picture here is silence. Interestingly, there was a relatively little support to the Rohingya cause from other religious minorities in Myanmar as well, which is linked to their status, I would argue, as protected groups among the 135. So there was little for other groups to gain from supporting the Rohingya cause. But what stood out during the fall of 2017 was actually the support to the military so-called clearance operations in the Rakhine state by Venerable Ashin Yanisara, mostly known as Sitago Sayadaw. And he is actually the most respected and powerful, influential and beloved monks in Myanmar. And here also meeting President Barack Obama. So he is a star. Now, what Sitago Sayadaw did was that during military clearance operations, so-called, in Rakhine state in October 2017, Sitago Sayadaw gave a sermon to Burmese soldiers at a location in the Karen state in times of massive violence. And what we can see here is actually a ritual. It's a Buddhist ritual. It's a praying time, and it's time for sermon. And you can see the soldiers sitting down here with their hands in prayers. What did Sitago Sayadaw say? This sermon became highly controversial after it was delivered. And let's have a quick look. What did he actually say? Well, what he said, and the sermon was given to a group of soldiers that were soon after this ritual were to be sent off to the battlefields in Rakhine. And he says, the victory of the battle is due to the power of the Dhamma, that is the Buddhist teaching, over King Duttagamani, who was a very famous king from Sri Lanka. The battle was won because of the effects of the power of the Dhamma. And as a result of the unity of the monks in fighting the battle together, the battle was over. That was how they had a landslide victory in beating the invaders. And he says, in order to have a safe and secure Buddha Sasana, which means the Buddhism as a worldly entity, and to preserve and sustain Buddhism in this country and in the future, I fought this battle. Who made this solemn vow? King Duttagamani and King Ajatasattu, famous kings in Buddhist history. It's about unity, right? The monk goes on to the soldier. There must be unity between the king and its people, as well as a unity between the army and the Sangha. The four of them also have to be united. It's like the four legs of a chair. They all have to support the country. So the references he's making here is to a very controversial, I would say, classic text from Sri Lanka. So he borrows from the Sri Lankan Buddhist tradition to the text called the Mahavangsa, or the Great Chronicle of Ceylon, written in the 5th century AD, written by Buddhist monks, written in Pali, and it's written for honoring the kings of Sri Lanka, protecting Buddhism when Buddhism was perceived to be in peril. And I would say it's the sort of the most prominent source we have in Buddhism for just war ideology. This text has become very controversial, perhaps not so much in Myanmar. It's not that well known in Myanmar, but in Sri Lanka, it's very well known, and it's very controversial for this passage where the king glorified Duttagamanu says he's mourning in the battlefield, and then sacred man comes to him to comfort him after he had killed Tamil invaders. And then these saints say, from this deed arises no hindrance in thy way to heaven. Only 1.5 human beings have been slain here by thee, O Lord of men, saying that, well, king, you killed many people, but they were not real human beings. Only 1.5 human beings were slain. The one had come into the 3 refuges, the other had taken on himself the 5 precepts. Unbelievers and men of evil were the rest, no more to be esteemed than beasts. But as for thee, thou wilt bring glory to the doctrine of the Buddha in manifold ways. Therefore cast away care from thy heart, O ruler of men. This is, I would say, the most radical expression of dehumanization of your enemy that we can actually find in the Buddhist tradition. They were not human beings. They were unbelievers and beasts. So this is the historical sources that our Buddhist monk draws upon in his sermon to the Burmese soldiers. Now, what can we say of the structural factors for understanding this event? 1, the Tatmadaw, that is the name of the military in Myanmar, is comprised of Buddhists. The majority, overwhelming majority of the soldiers are Buddhists. And the state, I would argue, is also de facto a Buddhist state. What we see here is a good example of Buddhist military chaplaincy to console soldiers and boost their morale. So it's not only in Christian armies or in Christian majority countries that we will find military services. So we find this in Buddhist countries as well. We find it in Thailand, we find it in Sri Lanka, and we find it here in Myanmar. So Siddha Sayadaw was actually performing what Buddhist monks have performed informally or formally to Buddhist soldiers over the centuries. And what they urge them to understand is that from a Buddhist point of view, there is a need to protect against invaders and to justify and they justify the use of violence. So what we can say then is that in this case, we find Buddhist justifications of violence because, one, there is a close relationship between Theravada Buddhism and the state. Contemporary Buddhist protectionism or nationalism fits into Asian patterns of Buddhist historiography. And this is where we get into, if not a cosmic war, I think that would not really fit in this context, but at the ideological level, we have these notions of threat and decline. And these tropes are there ingrained in the Buddhist tradition, and they can be activated in times of perceived peril. And that's where Buddhist just war ideology comes in and can be used. So there is a historical reservoir to be tapped into and drawn upon in times of perceived crisis. Jumping to the contemporary threat. The contemporary threat in Myanmar is the structural condition for that is the political liberalization, I would say, which has given rise to Buddhist protectionism. And at the same time, we see a new turn in Buddhist nationalism and the rise of anti-Islamic Buddhist movements. It's Islam that is seen as the great threat to the state, to Buddhism, and to Burmese majority culture. And it's also followed by new legislation to prevent Islamization of Myanmar that was passed in 2015. And here, many of you, I'm quite sure, have seen this front page of the Time magazine from June 2013, where Venerable Uvirathu gave an interview to Hannah Beach in the Time magazine, and he proudly sees himself as the Osama bin Laden of the Buddhist tradition, fighting the right and just cause. So the question of Buddhism and violence, I think we're kind of past that stage where we ask, there is no place for violence in Buddhism. I think research over the last 2 decades have very clearly shown that, yes, we do have examples of Buddhist just war ideology. And that raises sort of overall questions about pacifism and the use of violence in the canonical sources. And my answer to that would be to say that in the canonical tradition, there is canonical ambiguity. You find both radical pacifism and the acceptance of the institution of warfare. And I would argue that Buddhism is not pacifist in any strict sense. And that what we see is that Buddhism lacks a systematic just war tradition. And I think that Siddha Gosaido's sermon is an example of that. There were no monks raising any issues of his interpretation of the Mahavangsa, or saying, do we really think that we can use the Mahavangsa that way? So it's not really an articulate discussion about the use of violence. But again, it's kind of left to be for radical monks to draw upon these sources when Buddhism is seen as to being in peril. And that would be what we call the Buddhist just war ideology. And then, I think that was what I had time for now. And thanks a lot for your attention. There is a new book out, edited by me and by Michael Jarrison, that looks into many of these questions, called Buddhist-Muslim Relations in a Theravada World. So thanks a lot.
Thanks so much. I'm sure that we'll try to find our way to that book. This raises, of course, a lot of questions, but before we're able to dig in a little bit more, we're going to move to another continent, another set of religious beliefs, and another kind of conflict religion configuration. And for that, we have with us Christoph Titica, who will speak about his fascinating work on the Lord's Resistance Army. Christoph, are you there? Christoph, I think you might be muted.
Okay, yeah, here we go. Yeah, thanks a lot, Per. Thanks a lot, Maya, for inviting me. I'm really glad to be in a seminar on this issue. I've been looking at the role of religion in the LRA for a long time, so I'm glad I can present this in a wider context here, looking at these issues more comparatively. So what I'll be talking about in the next 15 minutes is how religion played a role within the Lord's Resistance Army of Joseph Kony. And particularly, I want to look at the question, well, is religion, it's a question which has been lingering through some of the presentation. And is religion, is it a functionalist ploy? You know, is it about other things, or is it also a lived belief system by those who participate in it? Yeah, first some self-promotion. So I'm going to be using quite some images through this presentation, and these come from my recent book, which is called Rebelize, Photographs from Inside the LRA, and which largely uses photographs which are taken by the LRA rebels themselves as a way to understand practices within the LRA. So first, some background. So what is the LRA? So the LRA is a rebel movement which was started in 1986 to protect the population of northern Uganda, the Acholi, which feared a genocide and to undo marginalization. Throughout the years, violence became both a means and an end. It spiraled out of control in the conflicts with the Ugandan government. A main tool of recruitment by the LRA was abduction. In 2006, it was estimated that close to 38,000 children and the same amount in adults had been abducted. These drawings which you see here, they're drawings which are used by former abductees to describe their experiences. Religion played a hugely important role in the LRA. It has often been used to exoticize the LRA as a bunch of madmen or as lunatics. However, religion is embedded or is part of long-term local and historical cultural processes. In northern Uganda and Acholi society, spirit and spirit possession play an important role. So when I talk about religion, I talk about local/traditional religious processes of spirits and spirit possession. Joseph Kony and the LRA, they were very much part of these local traditions. Before the LRA started, there were other rebel movements. You see here, Alice Lakwena and the Holy Spirit. There's an excellent book by Heike Berendt written on this. And then her father, Father Severino, who took over the fight. Joseph Kony is rumored to be the cousin of these two, and he took over the fight, but also embedded in these religious practices. It was felt that traditional rebellion had failed, and that's why religion took over. Joseph Kony was seen very much as a product of these religious traditions. He was a messenger, the Lao of the spirits, which communicate the rules of the spirits to the movement. There's about 20 to 30 spirits who tell him what to do. There's a lot of rituals, there's religious functionaries, and so on. Important is that life and death within the movements are associated with these spiritual rules. If you don't obey the rules, you're going to be killed. If you're killed by a bullet on the battlefield, it's because you didn't obey the rules. If you had sexual intercourse when you were not allowed to by the spirits, a bullet will hit your penis, and so on. So the spiritual and military control, they were closely associated. Numerous examples were given of the special powers of Joseph Kony, of him performing miracles, as provoking earthquakes, of foretelling the future, and so on. But in doing so, his authority was further strengthened within the movement. He was the only one who was able to communicate with these spirits. For the rebels themselves, there was a constant feeling, or there is a constant feeling, that the spirits are watching them and that they know what they are doing. Many rebels testified, or many abductees, that they didn't escape when they had a chance to, because they were convinced that Joseph Kony could read their minds and that he had mind control over them. So here you see a drawing of some of the former abductees of, well, one abductee you see brutally being punished of trying to escape because his mind could have been read. In other words, the environment in which the rebels are operating is no longer quote unquote ordinary, but it has become a strongly cosmological space in which all parts of life have become influenced by the spirits. For example, many rebels, they narrated extensively how nature had become part of this cosmological space. For example, they said on certain instances, when you saw a rainbow on your way, they couldn't go to the battle. Or when they could see rain, you should go ahead because they had been cleansed. Also, the kind of animals became part of this cosmological space. Within the LRA, abductees had to face several dangers. They had to survive in the bush. They had to fight dangerous animals. They had to fight diseases. They had to fight the government soldiers, and so on. There was only one way to survive all these dangers, and that was by obeying the spirits. On the one hand, it gave them power. On the other hand, it further tied them in the movement, and it made them further dependent on Joseph Kony. As I said, non-obedience to these rules made them being killed on the battlefield. In other words, by relying on these spirits, it further entrenches a spiritual and cosmological vocabularium which Kony had established and over which he had the ultimate control. Everything which happened and which occurred was being given interpretation within this particular framework. In other words, agency, having particular powers, and domination, they were being very closely entrenched. Let me give you one example. I'll give you the example of an informant who I will call Andrew. Soon after abduction, Andrew started realizing the power of the spirits. He saw things which he had not seen before and which exerted a strong power, such as the stone bomb. You picked a stone from the ground and it exploded like a grenade. The stone bomb, it was so powerful during that period. For example, in place X, there is a railway line. The stone bomb, it was simply splitting the railway lines. It was something spiritual. We would perform a ritual around the rock, sprinkle it with water, and it would explode. Particularly, Joseph Kony's Holy Spirit would impress him. Various examples were being given of the Holy Spirit's power to predict things, such as attacks from government soldiers, or which village was going to give them food. Gradually, the power of the Spirit became clear to him. In his words, I witnessed a lot of miracles with my own eyes. I felt the power of the Spirit, and I cannot lie. Like when we went to fight, there would be 11 of us against an army of 600 people. We would win, and there would not be any injury. And this would further encourage the fighters. When the order came from the Holy Spirit, it was easier to attack because the order, it came from above, from another kind of power. When the Holy Spirit said this, you feel more motivated to do this. This image is one of the sons of Joseph Kony. It's Ali Kony. The photo was taken in 2002. He's now the second or third in command based in the borderlands between Sudan and South Sudan. Also, Andrew felt the protection of the spirits. The spirits, they were protecting me. If you were following the rules well, they would never kill me. In other words, these spiritual elements, they would play a positive role in that it gave them a feeling of power. And in doing so, it would tie the individual further into the movement. Paul Richards has done excellent research on the RUF in Sierra Leone, where similarly abduction has pulled the abductee's life apart. But their rebel group or the abductee's life is put together again through a variation of methods, through initiation, through social control. But in the case of the LRA, it was spiritual rules and the cosmological space in which they were operating, which was putting their lives back together again. So through all of this, Andrew, he became increasingly part of this cosmological space, and he started experiencing these powers himself. He started seeing strange creatures. He had mystical experiences. He was able to speak with animals, and he acquired special powers to fight. So throughout my various interviews with LRA combatants over the last 20 years, numerous stories of strange creatures were being told, of snakes which in turn contained other snakes, of lions with women breasts, of witch doctors with giant teeth, and so on. Witnessing these miracles, having these stories circulating, it further strengthened the belief in the cosmological space and the LRA as a group. It can be called, again in Paul Richard's words, the group improvisation performance. The group, it believes because it acts together. By performing these various acts, by performing violence, by performing rituals, by sharing these stories, the belief in these spiritual powers is further strengthened on a collective and on an individual levels. So what are the key lessons which can be drawn from this? So first, the individual and the collective, they're closely interlinked. The individual rebel is looking for survival in incredibly dangerous circumstances, and in doing so turns to the spiritual aspects. He has no choice to succumb to the rules of the LRA and hence strengthen the collective. Second, much of the debates in social sciences is about agency and structures. And also this can be seen very strongly here. Many rebels, they felt they had achieved special powers through the spirits, but this was constrained within a larger structure of the LRA. As much as to put it differently, as much as these spiritual powers, they were a lived and a bodily experiences for many rebels, it also made them more dependent on the organization, on the LRA, and in particular on Joseph Kony. So on the one hand, it would give them powers to win battles, to dodge bullets, to see the future. But then on the other hand, it made them much more dependent on Joseph Kony. In other words, agency and domination, they are very closely intertwined. To put it differently, even though these rebels expressed and experienced individual powers, it also made them dependent on Joseph Kony. It's tactic rather than strategy. So to finish, I still have a few minutes left. This is more than an academic debate. It's also a debate which currently is being fought in legal terms at the ICC, the International Criminal Court. There's Dominique Ongwen, who was abducted as a child and who became one of the main commanders of the LRA. He surrendered a couple of years ago and he was flown to the ICC in The Hague, where he's currently in prison and where his trial is ongoing. One of the major debates is exactly the debates I have been presenting. So he's currently on trial for 70 counts of crimes against humanity and war crimes. And the key debate is, well, was it structure or was it agency? Was he a victim of being abducted by the LRA and a victim of these spiritual practices? Or could he, as the prosecutor said, could he have decided to escape at any moment and leave the LRA? The defense team uses the duress argument. How much longer do I have, Per?
Maybe wrap up, yeah.
Okay, I'll wrap up. Okay, I thought I still had 2 minutes. Okay, so the defense team says, well, the spiritual practices controlled his movements. He had no choice but to follow Kony. The prosecutor says, well, no, he could escape when he wanted to. So I was called in also as an expert on this issue. Others were asked to testify. And Ajwaka, a healer, former rebels, they were asked to testify on these spiritual practices. So past research has shown how the ICC or international courts showed that the international tribunals are deaf to unrealistic Western norms and local magic beliefs. This was also the case in the Ongwen trial. The prosecutor questioned me and said that they were looking for laws of science, for laws of biology, chemistry, and physics to establish what they called objective truths. Yet research on religion and violence uses different methods. It doesn't look for factual truths. It's concerned with meanings and functions of metaphysical manifestations and the impact on behavior. It's less interested in causality and responsibility. In other words, a forensic approach would check if Andrew, the informant I introduced, was really bulletproof, if he really could experience these powers. In other words, what this shows is the difficulty of translating these religious worldviews into legal practices. Judgment is due on the 4th of February. I'll stop it here.
Thanks, Christoph. That was fascinating, and I think it really ties together some of the themes that have been under the surface and popping up earlier in this fascinating seminar. So before we get to the chance to discuss some of these themes, I think it's time to introduce Maya. Maya, you've been also looking at the socialization of people into these kind of religious groups, and so yeah, tell us about it.
I'm just going to unmute. You can hear me now?
Yes.
Yes, good. Yeah, I think the way I want to tell the story is by starting with some of the questions that that Mark poses, because there are some of the same questions that I started out with when doing my field work. That this is the not going through the slideshow when I press the button. Let me just try that again. Yeah, there we go. Can you still see the show?
Nope.
No. Oh. Can you see the
Yes.
slideshow now?
Now we do, yes.
Perfect. So this was a fieldwork that sort of developed a bit organically as Danes started to travel out to the Middle East as foreign fighters, and I started following some of the first ones that left and continued to follow as they were there, and they came back to Denmark as well, and most of them would travel several times, so there would be time in between as well. And some of the starting questions were some of the ones that Mark posed about to which extent does religion cause violence? What's the role of religion in this? How can we understand this as maybe as worldviews better, or to kind of adopt that kind of insider perspective to try and understand their actions from the rationalities that they're based in and the social situations that they're based in. Because there are several elements that were unusual, right? Like it's unusual that you have people attending or like giving up their lives to take part in a conflict that they're from an outside perspective are not very connected to. And another thing that was unusual, which is what I'll focus a bit on today, is that we saw, well, surprising, I would say, for most amount of people coming out of non-religious, non-activist backgrounds, but more coming out of like criminal, organized criminality kind of backgrounds, gang backgrounds. So there are a couple of questions that were interesting to pose about that, like these, what was unusual about what we saw. In my own fieldwork, I found that about half of the people that I encountered came out of these criminal backgrounds. And I think there's a little bit of selection bias to that they were a bit more a bit less risk averse in terms of maybe in general and about talking to me and so on. But I'll highlight 3 of those stories today because I think there are a couple of interesting things to it. And initially we were sort of wondering, I guess, if they challenged like the emergence of this category within the group of foreign fighters were challenging how we understood radicalization before, or trying to understand radicalization before. And I would say that is probably the case, but what is more interesting to look at, or what I will try to focus on, is what it highlights. Like what can we understand better by seeing this? So rather than trying to reorganize a probably already overtly ordered theory, try to see what we can see that they open up to understanding. So just briefly, like the analytical approach into it is trying to understand it from an approach based a bit in existentialist thought. as taking as a point of departure that we as humans are meaning-seeking creatures, and that our actions are actions that make life meaning for us, in a sense. And if we take that way into it, there's a way of understanding fighting and militancy as a ritualistic liminality in which you make yourself. So they would talk up, like informants would talk up going as an element very closely related to how they saw themselves as agents, as individuals in this world. But what I will also argue is that how that happens, how these big cosmic events and big cosmic scenes allow for that kind of very dramatic self-making in the image of the hero or the image of the martyr, etc., is in very, very close relationship with one's former experiences, with the lives that one is coming from, and also in the case of all of these informants are returning to afterwards. So they're not divorced from those lives, even though the settings are very dramatic. But to understand that role of violence as something that's actually formative of one's own self, I think Frantz Fanon is one of the very few philosophers that really guides us in that aspect, that gives us some way of understanding how violence is not just something that is harmful to the constitution, to the individual constitution, but it's actually something that's formative for it. And he says it can have potentially a cleansing force on the individual to go out and perpetrate violence in a setting. But he also points to something that's quite key there, I think, in particular in these cases, is that it has to have some kind of moral telling. There has to be some kind of story around it that is moral and ethical. Because what these guys came out of, that's a bit unusual, is they came out of inherently violent settings. So this is the only of the informants that I give name to, because my husband and his colleague Najib Kaya did this documentary on this fellow who's called Abde, who was a gang leader in Denmark and who quite early on left with the intention to fight in Syria. And he came out of a clearly very violent world and setting and everyday. So that was not a new thing for him. So the question was what difference religion then made, which is something that's often quite difficult to get a bit to theoretically when we go through empirical data. And these cases of gang members really opens up a bit, I think, what difference does the religion make to their activities that are meaningful in a different way than secular violence within gang environments might be. And what he says is that he also shows how this develops over time. So he starts by traveling out because he struck sort of a very clear deal with God, that he asked God for a favor at one point, which was the only time he's ever prayed in his life, he says. But he asked God for a favor, and he said if he returned it, he would become religious and become pious. And then he really struggles with that in his everyday. Like, he's not doing very well with praying 5 times a day and living up to the not drinking alcohol, etc. And then it comes to his mind that he could go and fight in Syria instead. And then that would be living up to this promise of becoming pious. And then gradually, as he goes, and he goes several times, that sort of becomes a bit reinterpreted into this notion that actually by fighting, God will bestow him another favor, which is to actually free him of his former sins while he fights. So he has this idea, this quote says that he's done so bad things that there is no praying that could make up for it. And also just living like an ordinary good life could also not make up for it. So he kind of needs this really grand act that can come in the stead of his own sort of self-relationship and free him of what he has done before. And that's very, very loosely based on some theology that was sort of twisted a bit in the way that that these jihadist groups would put out recruitment materials and try to mobilize fighters. So they try to sort of give that impression to fighters that by fighting you could become completely free of sin. And it's not a very sort of theologically sound way that they would communicate that. And that was probably quite well put, because people like Abde and these other guys that I'm presenting here wouldn't have been interested in theological discussions. They were interested in very simple transcendent solutions to problems that they were having in the everyday. But it shouldn't be made to sound too instrumental, because I think there was like a very deep process going on with several of these people. So one person described being incredibly moved by the materials that he would see from these recruitment channels and mobilization channels, and come to this conclusion that this quote here from the interview speaks to, of sort of how can you mourn the death of the child and decry the bombing of his house as a catastrophe if you're not willing to kill the pilot that bombed her house before that happened, right? So that notion of sort of robbing themselves of the right to have any kind of emotional response to what they see going on, without actually taking the step to go and put themselves on the line to stop what's going on and to go and fight. And several people described like sort of going so far into that they're not able to sleep at night. They're not able to really enjoy. They can't sit and just have coffee with friends. Like everything feels false, and they begin to see themselves as hypocrites and cowards, which are terms that are very far from how they would normally speak of themselves as very authentic and very brave people. And so in order to maintain any kind of stability of how they see themselves and how they want to see themselves, how they want to be able to live with themselves as honorable individuals or as people, men, they come to this point where it's about going or not going. And I think it's interesting to see that that's no longer a choice at some point. It's no longer you choose to go or to do nothing. You choose to go or you choose to stay, and choosing to stay was a harder choice to make at a certain point when they were so deep into these reflections. So I kind of put it like this, like there's a moral crossroads where it's about how do you understand yourself as a person in the world. And you're offered by this idea of that by the first drop of blood when you're fighting on the battlefield, you're offered this fast track to absolution where you are both redeemed of your sins, but you're also redeemed of any kind of notion of you being an unworthy individual. And you are offered the opportunity to completely stand out as a hero, as an honorable individual. If we set that up a bit as a ritual to really understand the transformative power that the transcendent has, one way to put it here is like that there's this phase where they come to this point of no return. They have this moment before going where they really need to understand what that means to them. While they're there, they begin to reinterpret a little bit their fighting. And when they return home, it's supposed to sort of be incorporated into their lives, but that is a bit where it gets complicated, because most people return and are then not acknowledged. So they're being rejected from the criminal groups that they're in, that doesn't see any kind of sense to what they're doing or doesn't find it meaningful. And they're being rejected also from the religious environments that they are perhaps hoping to come back and be able to enter the mosque and be welcomed as glorious fighters. And instead they get into the mosque still full of their scars and their tattoos, and that's and that's how they still feel that they're received as these kind of thugs. So I'm conscious that I need to wrap it up now, and I'll just say like very few words about sort of just this notion that I want to end on, that I think we can't understand this element of criminals fighting jihad as something that's unique. I think we need to understand it as well as everyone else, that there's the way that they fight and the meaning that it gives to them relates to their former experiences in the world. It offers them some ways often to restore crisis of how they see themselves, and that it offers a way for them to do it through some of the competencies they already hold, such as fighting and violence. So just to finish on the question of what difference religion then makes to that fighting, to compare it to, say, fighting just what they're used to in their gangs, it offers this projection of morality. So if you don't have God in the picture, you don't have a chance of proper redemption, of really seeing yourself as sin-free, because you can't heal yourself in that way. So there's this transcendence that will allow you to not just exist, but actually live with yourself in a more ethical way than you were able to prior. And maybe I can touch a bit more on that in the Q&A, but I'll end here. Sorry for going over time here.
Don't worry, Maya. That was a fascinating presentation, and you certainly deserved the extra minutes that you took for going through your argument. So my name is Peer. I'm your host here for the Q&A session. We've had a great in-depth discussion with Juergensmeyer about the kind of general dynamics of worldviews, cosmic conflicts, as we called it here, and the relationship between religion and conflict. And I think that in calling this session Cosmic Conflict, we really want to get at two different things. Not only the role of religion in conflict, in worldly conflict, in warfare, if you will, but also, and I think this was really brought out really well during the last three presentations, the kind of individual conflicts that people have internally to kind of struggle with contradictions in the world. And I hope that during this discussion session we can kind of touch on that. So we have a couple of questions already from the panelists, for the panelists, which I would like to just pose before I give you all around the opportunity to reflect on perhaps each other's presentations and the kind of comparative things that you see emerging, as well as on the questions. So here's one general question that we have. This one is actually from Helene, co-organizer of the session. So what difference does it make actually, if you have an analytical perspective that takes religion seriously? What does it kind of add to our understanding based on your experience of the nature, cause and solution to violent conflict, even if the stakes perhaps are not purely religious? So what I want to do is perhaps propose that we kind of do a round in which we kind of stick to the order of presenters. So Iselin, what's your take on this? You're still muted, Iselin.
Sorry. Yes, well, thanks a lot. It's a great question. I mean, the question, perhaps. I would say that in my work on Buddhism and violence, it has really been to tease out the justifications and the meaning worlds, both to combatants involved in armed conflict, but also to political actors, let's say in the peace process in Sri Lanka, that no one at the time really understood how on earth can Buddhist monks refuse to engage in a peace process. And it didn't really make sense at the time that the monks were demonstrating and burning the Norwegian flag outside the Norwegian embassy in Colombo. So to me, it seemed to be a whole gap in our understanding of conflict dynamics at sort of a general level. But I would also like to add, and I think this is a kind of a comment and a question to my fellow panelists as well, is that it seems to me that when we compare our presentations today, including Juergensmeyer's presentation, we seem to work within a framework of religion and violence being relevant for understanding agency, motivation among rebel groups, members of rebel groups. But we do not seem to apply those kind of theories to standing armies or state formations of violence. I think my case fits into that, but I would very much like to hear my fellow panelists thinking about it. It seems that we reduce it to the religious informed rebel groups against the secular state, which of course is not the case, but how to think about the links between religion and violence then.
Thanks. Christoph, do you want to pick up there?
Yes, and yeah, thanks for mentioning that, Iselin, because indeed, yeah, I like the metaphor of a forest fire, which was coined earlier, because indeed, you know, it's a fire which doesn't only go through these rebel groups, but which is part of a broader context and which creates a kind of snowballing effect. So in the case of the LRA, you know, these spiritual practices, they were very much a local reality with long historical roots, etc. And so the LRA was the product of that. And it further intensified these processes, but government armies, they became part of that. You know, it became kind of a ritual which was performed and strengthened together, in the sense that LRA fighters, they believed that they wouldn't be hit by bullets. They believed they were kind of invincible, and government fighters started believing in it and started, you know, normally we only need 1 or 2 bullets, but now we need, you know, I don't know, a whole bunch of them to be able to kill them. And they in turn, they would also go to witch doctors to protect themselves from the LRA. The Minister of Defense around 10 years ago famously, no, longer ago, 15 years ago, famously coined that, you know, we cannot win this war, we need to rely on spiritual healers to do so, which was very much an excuse why they could never finish the war and why they were profiting from it. But it shows this broader framework of which is its part. So on the role of, you know, religion and the importance in solving conflicts, well, it reminds me a lot of discussions, particularly in the field of African studies, which are being held on the role of ethnicity, for example. You know, is it ethnic conflicts, or, you know, what's the role of ethnicity? You know, it's the same for religion. To what extent is it being instrumentalized? Well, I guess it's not a black and white answer. As many of the presentations have shown, it's, you know, you have this whole mix in which religion plays an important role, but it can't be simply reduced to it. I'll stop it here.
Thanks. Maya? You're muted, Maya.
Sorry, here we go. Yeah, I think I had a really interesting experience when I was doing the fieldwork, where I came across kind of randomly a fellow PhD student at a different department who was doing his fieldwork on Danish national soldiers with like very much the same analytical framework that I was applying to foreign fighters. And it was really interesting to compare notes, because again, it got a bit to the question of, does religion even make a difference, or they're just more like existential drivers at play that then you know, that could take any kind of form, and what's yeah, and I think I'm just personally quite interested in when things are a bit less structured. So I would be more interested in looking at it from the rebel perspective. And there I thought that if I compared notes, there was this element of the transcendence of something that was actually able to transform the individual in a fundamental way was something that stood out as quite unique, and the imaginatory world that religion provides to reinterpret what you're doing without sort of being too hung up on the formal descriptions of that. which also speaks a bit to the question of how do we take religion seriously? Because I think one of the ways that I was surprised that religion had to be taken seriously in the fieldwork was as something that's improvised. So not on this, so stepping away from understanding religion as something that's very formal and quite ritualized or has like clear parameters, and see it as the lived experience of those that left, because I couldn't rob them of their claim that what they were doing was religious. If it's religious to them, it's religious, right? But it's religious in a way that you wouldn't encounter in the school books in any way or form. So that, I guess that's what taking religion seriously for me means, is to bracket what we understand as religion usually, and then being willing to understand what it means to those that we're speaking to.
Thanks. So that's something I think we can return to in just a second. For now, there's a question from the audience for you, actually, Maya, from a certain Liane Vostermans, who wants to pick up on the fact that you mentioned existentialism. Conceptualize the impact of existential anxiety on continued violent mobilization, and what are the obstacles and opportunities there? And she asked also, what mediating role can religion play here as opposed to political ideologies?
Well, I guess we can understand existential anxiety in different ways in a case like this, right? Like we can zoom in on the individual and understand existential anxiety as that person in that person's life situation. And I think those that come out of the criminal gangs had in some ways more were somehow more existentially grounded than some of the other people that left that weren't, because they had their community, they had their sort of their environment. But there are certainly still, like, there are huge anxieties around how they would understand themselves still as moral beings, and how they would see themselves in relationship to a world where they were constantly rejected from all sides. But we can also understand the existential anxiety in a slightly larger scale. So we can understand the existential anxiety of Muslim communities in Denmark, in the West, as really often existentially rejected, right, from what it would mean to be a Dane or a person here. And we can understand it in the sense of the existential anxiety of modernity, of the time we live in, where there's a lack of grand stories, of grand projects, of scenes on which to come to have these kind of big rites of yourself, where you completely change your own sort of progression as a person. So I see different analytical levels to how we would deal with existential anxiety, and all of them could play into sort of mobilization. What are then the obstacles and opportunities and the mediating role that religion can play here? I'm not sure if that's really what to answer to that, to be honest. I'm not sure religion, that we can sort of apply religion in that kind of way to settings that are this sort of improvised, to be honest. I think what we can do is that we can maybe try and readdress a little bit how ordered we've understood these kind of phenomena theoretically, because our theories have been very grounded in a need to order this in terms of processes and very causal understandings. And I think that maybe we can begin to bring in a bit more insecurity around that.
That's great. I think it also leads nicely into another question we have from the audience, from Martijn Oosterbaan. So he asks, and he kind of follows up there on a remark by Professor Friedenlund. So should we not question this idea that religion primarily is something, kind of band-aid? It's something that provides redemption and only comes in such a role to fix things that are shattered. That's something that Professor Juergensmeyer also suggested. Exactly when states have been enmeshed with religions, there seems to be no shattering which is there to be fixed. And I think I want to kind of add to that another layer. I've been curious to see that all three of your presentations, you rely on a different kind of theoretical background, right? We have more anthropological approaches, a more theological approach. Christoph, your background is more political science, I believe. So what do these different perspectives reveal, and exactly where can they complement each other? Perhaps you can go in the order of speakers again. So Iselin.
Yes, thanks a lot, Martin, for your question about the state. In my view, it seems that the discussion relates around the, again, structure and agency, again, about the individualistic and the structure. And I think that this, the question about existential anxiety, the question about religion being able to repair the shattering, it fits very well with a individualistic perspective. And the question then, does it fit in with the state perspective or a state-centered perspective? And I think that yes and no, I would say. I mean, if we look at the colonial past in Asia, there is no question about the shattering of the state. Of course, that was what the British did in Burma. They shattered the state and rebuilt a new one, which claimed to be religiously neutral, which of course it was not. But it was introduced both the category of religion and of the secular, which formatted the conceptions of the religious and the secular in very, very particular ways. Now, this notion that we find among Buddhist populations across the post-colonial world in Asia would be that the colonial power shattered the state and its duty to protect Buddhism. So the whole post-colonial project seen from a Buddhist nationalist point of view would be to repair, and you repair through state structure. So I think that a metaphor of shattering and repair can be used both at the individualistic as well as the structure state level. Yes, but the question, of course, is that when it comes to state structure, you will always have pressure groups that would never be satisfied with the repair. So you will always have these groups that engage in so-called religious outbidding, which is a term that Monica Toft used for the Islamic world, but I think we can actually apply it in the Buddhist world as well. So when Myanmar opened up in 2011, we saw political liberalization. That was shattering of the previous state. Again, the question of shattering. It created an enormous insecurity and anxiety. And what came in to fill that gap, that void, that provide that security? Well, Buddhist monks and the religious tradition or the imagination of what the tradition should be, right? And then the claims that the state should be engaged in repairing of the shattering. Yes, I think that was my comment to that question. Yes, and then on your question, Pierre, on different backgrounds. Yes, I speak from a religious studies point of view. So this question, can Buddhism ever justify violence or not, is sort of where I come from. And then I've been engaged in empirical studies that shows the ways in which that, yes, Buddhism or Buddhist actors clearly engage in justifications of violence. But yes, I think my question relates more to how is it possible that the so-called pacifist tradition can be so goddamn violent at times?
Thanks, Christoph.
Yeah, thanks. I'll be brief because we don't have many minutes left, I'm mistaken. So yeah, I liked this discussion on existential crisis and on shattering quite a bit because it rings true a lot with what I've been studying. So, well, so in the case of the LRA in Northern Uganda, religion stepped in because you had this shattering or this existential crisis at these different levels. At a society or at a political level, you know, there was a fear of genocide. At a moral level, traditional authorities were being eroded. at an individual level. So you had all these people which were being abducted. And that's where religion and spiritual practices came in as a response to all these crises and this shattering at these different levels. So yes, religion is seen as an answer to that. So, and the question of disciplinary perspective also ties into these different levels. So it needs to be understood and tied into these different levels, and different disciplines can help to give answers on these different levels. Of course, some disciplines have been more useful in my research than others. You know, the emic perspectives of these actors is crucial, hence, you know, anthropological insights have been useful, but it's per definition multidisciplinary to look into that. And for example, the field of military studies has also been useful for me in how religion taps into and strengthens military perspectives.
Thanks, Christoph. Maya? You're muted again.
Yes, there we go. Yeah, I can only second that about having the usefulness of the different perspective, and only use that as a way to call for more openness in publication phases about that, because I really feel that that's all, like whenever you talk about this at conferences and seminars and in conversations, we always experience this, that there's so much overlap between different methodological and theoretical approaches and disciplinary backgrounds. And then when you send the paper for publication, you get reviewer 1 and 2 who says, oh, this is not what my field is, and this is not what, and you're not doing what my field says you should be doing, etc. So often I feel that that's where things then sort of gets boxed a bit again, right? Then you have to fit into whatever box that's presented there. So that's just a little activist call towards more interdisciplinary willingness in the publication phase.
Thanks. I think that's a nice note on which to end and think about ways forward. I want to thank all the speakers. You've done an amazing job. We've been here in the past 2 hours. In this early morning for some, and for some people late night for Juergensmeyer, to tap into the fact that in so many conflicts around the world today, religion plays such a crucial role. And we've had an amazing set of speakers to try and untangle some of the kind of aspects and entanglements of religion, worldview, warfare, or more local level kinds of civil conflict, and to really try and dig into some of the kind of different entanglements that that structure and shape these things. We've talked about shattering as a kind of nice way to think perhaps forward about some of the things that that emerge across these different kind of contexts. We've talked about how people are socialized into these movements and what roles religions and worldviews play in keeping people inside movements. This was a seminar organized by DIIS. If you're curious about more of the seminars that we're organizing, some of the things you can look at on our website, which is mentioned here in the site. Please do not hesitate to get in touch with any of the speakers with any follow-up questions you might have. And we hope to see you soon again at DIIS. Have a great day and thank you so much.